Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Sharper Angle event, Media Training Your CEO in the Age of Zoom. I am Paul Maccabee, president of Maccabee Public Relations in Minneapolis, and I'm thrilled to introduce our two communications experts today. We have Kim Inslee, veteran multimedia journalist with over 24 years experience at NBC TV, affiliate CARE, as well as her being the former strategic marketing manager for technology company Digital River. We also have from Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, Ed Marks, communication strategy consultant and author of many books, I'm jealous, Ed, including Reporters Don't Hate You, great title, 100 plus amazing media relations strategies. And now, Kim and Ed, let us begin. It is a Zoom world, as we're doing right now. Kim, Ed, what are 3 steps that our audience can take to ensure that their CEO or spokesperson has a successful virtual media interview, whether they're on Zoom, MS Teams, Skype? Kim, let's start with you. What can we do to make sure our CEO, when he's interviewed by the media on Zoom, does well?
Well, let's talk about the Zoom or the Teams element, right? So what you want to do is make sure that you have the technology right to begin with. We have all painfully sat through people trying to connect, and there will be problems, right? I make sure that I have my executives' phone numbers so I can text if there's an issue to take care of an emergency. I would prefer that they join early so that we know that they're ready. Reporters are busy people, right? And they have deadlines. So it really doesn't help if the executive's texting, I'm still in a meeting, I'm going to hop soon. Try to get there on time, work with their executive assistant to schedule that time beforehand. And back to the technology, and I'll admit, I don't always have it right in my setup, but have adequate lighting, have adequate audio. You do not want these to be hurdles that get in the way of the communication. Make sure the surroundings are what you want. I know Ed has a strong opinion on background, so I'll let him speak to that because I happen to agree with him. And be prepared for technical problems. You want to troubleshoot as much as you can. There's a lot more I would say, but I want to give Ed a chance, having gone through this a little bit before. I think we're in sync with how we feel about those things.
I think you're right.
Ed.
I think you're right, Kim, that a lot of what you said really resonates. Paul, I'm going to take a step back and talk on a more macro level about one thing, because when Zoom and Teams and other similar services came into really the mainstream 2.5 years ago, the question was, well, what do I do? How do I handle this new thing? And my answer to that is there's just one thing that's changed. It's the technology. It's just the technology that's changed. So the 3 things that are really important and that I like to emphasize with clients in every media training routine: message, technique, and attitude. Now, a lot of companies I know pay a lot of attention in varying degrees to messaging and to technique of their executives and their spokespeople and how they communicate. The missing element in many, many companies is attitude. So you've got to have your spokespeople understand that the media is not necessarily out to play gotcha. Now, if they are, you're likely to know about it, and you have to brief your folks so that they have an understanding of how to react in an environment like that. And we can get into some details on how to deal with that. But essentially, those 3 things, Paul, that you asked about: message, technique, attitude.
And Ed, building on that, you had said in our previous conversation that media training or coaching for a thought leader, CEO, etc., is not a one-time thing. Can you expand on that?
I'd be glad to. Thank you so much for mentioning that, because this is a pet peeve of mine and has been for the 25 plus years I've been in business doing this. It's not an event. It is a process. How often, and I'm sure, Kim, you may have experienced the same thing. You get a call. Somebody says, hey, my so-and-so, my executive needs media training. And their thought is media training it happens in this box of a room, one time, might be a full day, might be a half day, might be a few hours, whatever those time parameters are. That's a kind of media training, but that's only one aspect of media training. There's so much more that goes into it. It has to be a matter of sustained professional development if you hope to get your spokespeople up to speed as effective advocates for your company. So that may involve another, kind of full-blown media training workshop down the road somewhere, but also think about what you can do internally. Think about those random moments, maybe a hallway conversation, maybe batting some Q&A back and forth with your spokespeople. So you can do a lot of this internally without your consultant who needs to be there for part of the equation and help you set the roadmap for what the professional development is going to look like. But there's a lot you can do on your own time as well.
And I think that's an important point because, having been on the receiving end of yes, we'd love to do media training this year and then have the budget disappear before you can ever get to it. So what you can do on your own is extremely important. Making sure that your executive has the right tools to do this. And one other thing that I would add is that as the comms person, you also can help the interview itself. I encourage everybody to, and I'm sure you do, to attend the interview, to get there early. And you have a few minutes there, usually, if the reporter's on, to gauge their mood, getting back to that attitude part. If the reporter comes in hot, and they're angry about something or whatever, you have an opportunity to smooth that out a little bit. It's not to make them your friend. Reporters aren't your friend. They're professionals, but to calm them down, frankly, if they need to be calmed down, and to break the ice a little bit. Because what I want most of all is that people on both sides are comfortable, even if it's an adversarial interview, but to have respect and as much comfort level as possible going into that interview so that they can do the best job possible.
Kim, in your quarter century of working with NBC affiliate KARE 11, you obviously had studio facilities, you had camera people, you had expert sound technicians, but now a lot of interviews are done in people's living rooms or kitchens. What advice do you have if your CEO or thought leader, from a lighting, sound, background standpoint, if they're not in KARE 11 studio, but they're at home, what's your advice on how to get a really good remote interview from a sound, lighting, and background standpoint?
It's tough because, early on, some people were literally working out of their bedrooms. I had executives working in the spare bedroom, in which case you're going to want to look at that background. Is the background appropriate? If they're doing a lot of interviews, you're going to make sure that the background looks professional. Some people like to use the virtual backgrounds. I am not a fan of that necessarily. Paul, you have a very good one right now because you're not clipping so much when you move. I've seen some very poor ones. And if the person is popping in and out of the frame because they like to move around and it's clipping, it's a distraction from the conversation. I like the actual background of the executive if they're okay with that, because to me, again, that humanizes them. I have a window behind me. The blinds are shut, but it still is a little, it's a little hot back there. So try not to have a window behind them so that they're backlit. You want light in front of their face. If there's a window, that's great. A ring light is great. If they don't have access to that, a lamp will work. I recommend a company called Sweetwater. And from them, you can get lighting kits. You can get microphones that plug into a computer. You want to get the best microphone that you can without spending a ton of money, right? They don't need a studio in their home unless they are going to be doing a lot of interviews. They might want to look at that. But an adequate microphone so that is not a distraction. You're going to want to be in a room that doesn't have a lot of hard surfaces. If it's a room with no carpet and there's windows everywhere, sound is going to bounce off the walls, and it doesn't matter what kind of microphone you have, it's still going to sound hollow. So there's a reason why reporters in some circumstances will cut audio in their closet. All those clothes will dampen the sound. So try to have, a carpeted room, curtains in the room, even to the point of the desk. I'll have them put a cloth on the desk to absorb sound that way. Make sure phones are off, notifications are off, so you don't get those dinging noises in the middle of things. And, things like this, nervous habits, tap, 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 make sure they are aware that they should try to keep their hands down still or to a minimum, that they're not making sound with anything they're doing, not tapping on the microphone or whatever. So minimizing distractions, adequate lighting, and a decent microphone.
Kim, that was outstanding. Ed, you actually, Ed, great skin tones. You're obviously on your own Zoom, aware of the lighting and your background, which has, among other things, your books, which is great. So build on what Kim just said, lighting, sound, background. What do you advise your clients?
Well, the tough part is we've all been forced to become our own engineers. And I don't know, I'm sure there are varying levels of sophistication amongst the people who are with us today in terms of their technical abilities. I will share with you mine. Okay? I'm an ex-radio broadcaster. The engineers, wherever I worked, always made sure to keep me as far away from the gear as possible because they knew I was going to mess something up. So for me, it's been a stretch, and I had a lot to learn when this environment came into play back in 2020 at full force. So, think about what you need to learn to become a better Zoom person, a better Zoom spokesperson. Kim's already covered a lot of the sound and video capabilities. What I'll add on is an interesting fact a lot of folks don't recognize, that if a radio studio, and I'm sure, Kim, again, my background's in radio, the same may apply to TV. In a radio studio, if it's built right, it's not quite built to rectangular or square dimensions. It's off by a little bit, even just a few inches on one end, so that sound doesn't bounce around that square or rectangle. Okay. I'm speaking in a separate room in my office, my home office, and I have those kind of accordion doors that will open and close on a closet. What I do is I just pop those open just a little bit, just to give an angle there. The door to the hallway, it's open a little bit, so I've got another angle there just to kind of deaden some of that sound. So think about some of those things you can use to improve the sound and video quality while you're on a Zoom call.
Ed, that was outstanding. Kim, you mentioned the clicking of the pen, the nervous habits that can be a distraction when your CEO or thought leader is doing an interview. We're talking about nonverbal communication, tells, signals, etc. Kim, what's your advice of how communications professionals, marketing execs, should coach their thought leader to make sure that their nonverbal communication doesn't intrude on their verbal communication?
It varies with the executive. I have executives that I have been pretty honest about in terms of their nonverbals and how they presented themselves. They wanted to improve, but they just couldn't break the habits in some cases. So I recommend that you let them see what the issue is so that they can understand it clearly. I recommend before an interview, you remind of those things so that it is top of mind. I don't want to freak them out, right? And have them only thinking about that, but I just want to, as a reminder, and I oftentimes I'm introducing everybody, and I might make that point if it makes sense. If we're recording it, it's dependent upon who controls that interview. But I also encourage them to, a lot of times people want to look at their notes, especially if they're trying to get the messaging right. Look in the camera, because that is the person looking back at you. They're going to see that. If I'm looking off here, it's a little off-putting. So try to avoid that as much as possible. engagement when you're not speaking is just as important as the engagement while you are speaking. If the reporter is saying something and that's the time that you decide to pick up your phone and check a message, don't do that. Some of us remember the President Bush, the first President Bush, that debate where he checked his watch. I don't know what he was thinking at the time. Probably something perfectly legitimate, but the message that came across with that visual signal was, I don't have time for this. This isn't important. So your executive needs to understand and have the space that that interview, that reporter is the most important thing on the plate right there. And all of their focus should be at that.
Thank you so much, Kim. Ed, the name of one of your books is Reporters Don't Hate You. But when our PR firm, Maccabee, does media training and media coaching, we do throw in one final, shall we say, gotcha question. We think of what's the worst question we could ask that CEO so that he or she is ready for it. So what is your advice to your clients about how to deal with an uncomfortable question asked in perhaps a live interview?
I'm glad you raised the notion of Q&A, Paul, because that is, let's face it, that's at the heart of a lot of media interviews. The reporter has the question, you have a response. Now, there's some other elements we can enter into that as well, and it comes into play in this way. I like to suggest that clients break up anticipated questions into 3 groups, and I always suggest write them down. Don't just depend on it being in somebody's head. Write them down. And the 3 groups are the questions you expect. You know, they might be, tell me about your new product. What's your new initiative all about? Why is it happening? The second basket are what I call the friendlies. These are questions you want the reporter to ask. And you may even prime the pump with a reporter so that they have a list of questions from you. Now, are they likely to go down the list? Not in most cases. Now, if you do a podcast interview, that's a little different because most podcast hosts and producers are frankly not that skilled at interviewing. So that may get you some points there. So we got the ones you expect, you got the friendlies, and then that third basket, as you might have guessed, are the questions you never want to hear pass a reporter's lips. So what you need to do once you define what those questions are and what issues they address is what part of your message best addresses that particular issue that the reporter is raising. If it's a tough question, I mean, there's some strategies you can use in terms of bridging, in terms of deflection, and we can get into some of the specifics there if you like. But you have to have the notion that yes, tough questions may arise. Be ready for them, even if it seems as though it's going to be a fairly non-controversial interview.
I'd like to add something to that too. This term gotcha has been stretched to include any question that the person doesn't like. A true gotcha question is, I have proof you were embezzling at the company. What do you want to say about that? That's a question that you didn't expect, that you would never in a million years expect. That's a gotcha question. I have this piece of information that's going to destroy you, and you didn't know I was going to ask it because it wasn't even on the agenda. Most hard questions can be anticipated. If you had a bad quarter, you can anticipate that the reporter is going to want to know why. And I would suggest that you frame it in your mind as, here is an opportunity for us to tell our story. Hopefully it's a good one. Sometimes it's not a good one, but it is your chance to tell your story and get it out there. If there is truly a crisis, and John Austin knows this, the crisis, an emergency, you want to get your story out there so that it is the first thing that people hear in the original story, so that your side, if you will, is presented accurately. And another thing as well, reporters today, if we were doing this for print and someone was going to write a print or digital article out of this, it wouldn't be as critical. But if it was for TV, radio in particular, they're only going to take 6 seconds, 8 seconds of what I say. So make sure you're very concise in your messaging and trying to eliminate that whole taken out of context complaint, which is real. I scream at the TV all the time because I see it all the time. So be aware that that is a risk.
Kim,
Well, and Kim, Paul, if you don't mind, let me just follow up on something Kim mentioned, which is so important, and that's the notion of messaging. I spoke a few moments ago about writing down the questions you anticipate. Please write down your messaging too. Right? I've dealt with too many organizations that they entrust it to the chief communications person. Now, if that person crosses the street and gets hit by the proverbial bus tomorrow, there go your messaging efforts. So write them down, make it concise, one page, 4 main points of your message, buttressed by facts or stories or what have you that will support and prove what you have to say. But you've got to write it down in a simple fashion, no fancy dialogues or no fancy diagrams necessary. Just write it down, and it's always going to evolve. So decide when you need to revisit it. In a crisis, it may be hour by hour, minute by minute. In something more evergreen, maybe a couple of times a year, but write them down, keep them cataloged, give them to your spokespeople so they understand what it is they're supposed to say.
Kim and Ed, a question for both of you. Some of the CEOs that our audience deals with love being interviewed. They love media and they're comfortable and they have the ego that enables them to have that charisma. That's wonderful when you have a CEO who welcomes either the camera or a reporter's microphone and notebook. But many of us have CEOs or clients with CEOs where they get really anxious. What's your advice on how thought leaders, spokespeople, CEOs can frankly calm down so that if they're on camera, but even if they're just talking to a reporter, let's say from the Wall Street Journal on the phone, they won't come off as anxious, stressed out, which I think comes across as less trustworthy to a journalist. How can we, as corporate communications people, help our thought leaders calm down? Ed?
I would suggest media training with Paul Maccabee or Ed Barks would be a good place to start. You're always going to have people who are nervous, and therefore you as a comms person, sitting them down and taking them through an interview process, recording it so that they can see what their nervous tics are, how they look, is going to be extremely helpful. And as Ed mentioned earlier, you don't want to do that just once. You want to do it often. I would suggest if you have someone who's very nervous, you want to put them on interviews that are of less importance first so that they have a chance to put a toe in the water before you stick them in front of national media. It can be scary and intimidating. The other thing to remember is that the reporter is trying to get a story. They're on deadline. They have issues. To be as clear and authentic as you possibly can is also going to be helpful. But to be honest, some people are just extremely nervous, and it's very hard. The more they do it, the better they get, but they might always not like it. I'll put it that way.
Ed, what would you add to Kim?
Well, so much of it is about preparation and how you prepare that executive to speak. And let's take the example of what we're focusing on today, which is Zoom. Now, it may be you're interviewed on Zoom, it may be Teams, it may be Skype, it may be any one of a number of services. As you're preparing, practice in the service that you are actually going to use. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if your principal is not used to working with Microsoft Teams, well, you better get them on there and have them figure out how they need to manage that piece of business on Teams. So it's all about preparation. It also gets back to attitude. So you might look for some ways to encourage your principal to kind of take that next step into media relations. Maybe it's finding a peer of theirs, a fellow CEO who can give them some words of advice, words of encouragement, because it's, I'm sure I experienced this as an in-house person as well. It's after a while, you tend to lose influence because they're hearing the same voice over and over again. Mm-hmm. So if you can find a fellow CEO, if you can lean on your communication strategy consultant to deliver those types of messages, that can be very helpful too. Before we go to the next question for you, Kim, and you, Ed,
we're coming close to the open Q&A section. Everybody who is on this Zoom call, feel free to put in the chat any questions that you want Ed and Kim to answer, and we will ask your questions. So please go ahead and post on chat your questions for Ed and Kim. Starting with Kim, television. TV used to be 3 networks, then it became cable, now it's streaming. It used to be shot in studio, now it's generally not, obviously not. From your experience, almost 25 years in broadcast television, where has TV evolved now? What's different about a TV interview today than it was 5 years ago?
I would say it might be a little more comfortable because obviously during the pandemic, everybody had to be interviewed via Zoom or Teams. And you'll notice that that has continued. Ideally, a television reporter wants to come to where you are, something else for your executives to remember, get back to you next week isn't going to work. If the TV reporter needs an interview, they likely need it within the next couple of hours. But back to your question, I see more Zoom interviews, which technically the things that we used to say would never ever work in TV, getting back to audio and all of those things, we learned to relax those standards a little bit. People are more forgiving. When you look at MSNBC, and to Ed's point, somebody is their own audio engineer who's being interviewed on national TV. And really, as long as we can hear and see them, we're okay with it. So the standards of that have relaxed a little bit. But the purpose of the interview has not. I mean, it still gets back to the messaging, the story, trying to get your point across in the best way that you possibly can. It's all about communications, and the medium, how it's delivered, will always change. I think media is a fascinating business right now, and many, many changes are coming down the line. But the messaging, the ability to communicate, if you have an executive who can communicate well, that is worth the weight in gold. It's amazing. I think reporters have less time. And so you get, for local TV in particular, a reporter will have to knock out a story, a shortened version of the story, a web version of the story. They might have to shoot and edit it themselves. So keep that in mind, again, respecting their time. I'll turn it over to Ed because I could probably blab on forever on this, but I just want to emphasize the messaging, the story, the communications piece will always be the same.
And Ed, before you start, a question for you, Ed. Someone just posted a question. What are the wardrobe rules for Zoom interviews? And I will just add from my personal experience, years ago, I was going to do an interview on Twin Cities Public TV. Don't ask me why, but I had just seen Saturday Night Fever with John Travolta, and I came into the studio in an all-white suit. And the studio engineer pulled me aside and said, "Good God, man, what were you thinking?" And they quickly removed my suit and put me in something that would not make me it seemed to be exploding on the camera. So, but Zoom is different. And we know that it's created something of an informality for many people. What's your advice, Ed, on wardrobe for a thought leader on Zoom?
Well, first and foremost, please, no John Travolta disco gear, none of that. And Paul, I mean, I appreciate your bravery in doing that. However, I think we'll try to avoid that one in the future. My basic rule of thumb for a Zoom interview is dress as if you were going into the studio. Dress professionally in business attire. Make sure your hair is combed. Make sure there's no, you're looking. You've either put makeup on or you've shaved that day, which I've done both. Yes, I do put a little bit of powder on because just to take away some of the glare from the lights. So dress as though you were going into the studio. It's number one, going to make you look more impactful to those who are viewing you, assuming it's a TV interview. And it's also it's within you. It's going to give you a better sense of your professionalism if you're dressed in that way.
And Paul, just so you know, TV studios, the cameras have gotten much better, so they can handle white usually, but the all white suit, that's quite a statement.
Yes. So for both of you, a question from Michelle Malashak. Before 2020 and the pandemic, reporters were used to phone interviews. Are those still acceptable, or do most reporters now expect interviews either to be conducted over Zoom or face-to-face? Kim, want to start?
Because the technology of Zoom or Teams allows you to see that person, most reporters would like to do it that way. I have not seen very many phoners in the last couple, 3 years even. There's no benefit for doing that. A TV reporter does now have the option of being there in person. And again, I think they would prefer to do it that way if time allows. But Zoom allows them to reach out to people who may not be within easy driving distance. So I would expect Zoom and Teams to stay with us for some time. And I do think it's preferable to a phone call where you don't see the other person.
Ed, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's funny how video has really overtaken things. Think of it. When is the last time you picked up the phone and called somebody just out of the blue? Right now, we've all got to schedule things, which kind of drives me nuts. Now, if the reporter is a print reporter and the video is not important, or a radio reporter for that matter, or a podcast interview that's going to be audio only, there's no reason you can't do that over the phone. Now, maybe with a podcast, since it's going to be recorded and the quality would suffer. But if it's a print interview, there's no reason you can't do that as a phoner. So if you want to do that, and there are some advantages to doing that. Number one, you can look at your notes and not be too obvious about it. That's something that you can just suggest to the reporter. Hey, let's just do this over the phone. How's that? And maybe they'll go for it. Maybe they won't, but you won't know until you try.
And the phone gives you the flexibility of doing it from anywhere, if you're in an airport or driving somewhere and someone else is driving. So it gives you flexibility that way.
For both of you, another question from our audience, the dreaded So you are working with your CEO or thought leader, and he or she keeps on filling the silence or the pauses or their breath with How do you train a thought leader so they're not filling their responses with ums?
Well, first of all, I'm not one to try to knock out everybody's ums, ers, and ahs. Now, if they get in the way of communicating, then yes, we'll need to find a strategy for dealing with that. We all speak, most of us at least, speak conversationally, and every now and then, one of those types of filler words, filler phrases gets in there. I don't think that's a bad thing. That's Ed's perspective. You'll hear different from different people. If it is something that gets to be too intrusive, then the first thing you want to do is record that principle and play it back. They may not be aware. So make them aware that that's what's going on. And then suggest perhaps they could pause if they're thinking about inserting an or an There are a number of strategies you can use, but the point is make them aware of what it is and then get them to practice. Now, that is not an easy trait to knock out. So it's going to take some doing, and so it's going to take some time. So think about how, again, I'm going to stress sustained over time. How can you manage that and improve that?
I totally agree with that. Practice makes perfect. Seeing how it looks on camera or sounds is definitely going to help that person understand the importance of it. You mentioned podcasts as well, Ed, and to that end, having worked on many podcasts with executives of all stripes, you run across this feeling that anything can be edited out, including the ums and everything. And we do work to edit those out if possible. However, again, if you can avoid that, I would just tell the executives to keep in mind that they should do everything as if it's live. They should try to put as few impediments as possible. If they are nervous, slowing down their conversation a little bit so that their mind is running a little bit ahead of their mouth can also help eliminate some of those ums and ahs and fillers.
Let's talk about trust, because a lot of what happens in a Zoom call is your CEO or spokesperson has an opportunity that I think on the phone is much more difficult to establish trust with a reporter, with a journalist, but through the journalist, hopefully, establish trust with his or her audience. Ed, Kim, what's your advice on how thought leaders, CEOs, executives can establish trust both with a journalist, but also with the journalist's audience? Ed, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's relationships, and trust is not something you can build in one interview or one call. It's a time intensive process. And I know I keep coming back talking about sustained this and sustained that, but it really is a long-term strategy and with respect to your media relations efforts. And trust you don't build in a day. So it's a matter of working with that reporter over time, giving them information they find useful for their stories, and giving them quotes from your principles that they can plug and play with very little difficulty. And then, of course, I hope I don't need to say this, but it's being honest and it's being straightforward in every case. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not like a courtroom where you have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You do have to tell the truth, and you do have to tell nothing but the truth, but you don't have to tell the whole truth. I mean, there are some things that you do not want to offer up. So think of it in that way as well.
Mhm.
Excellent. Kim, establishing trust for your spokesperson.
First of all, I'll say trust goes both ways. So it's up to the comms person to, as much as possible, vet the reporter before agreeing to an interview. If you're working with an agency, they might have prior experience with those reporters. And hopefully they wouldn't be sending a reporter your way who has proven to be untrustworthy. Assume that the reporter is a professional. They're not your friend. They're there to do a job. I agree with Ed. Building relationships is where the real trust begins. I like to think of it as a bank account. You're not just turning to that reporter when you need something. Oh, I have a press release. I want this reporter to put it out on. They don't care about most of your business. You want to Ed's point, if there's something interesting that you can provide for them or a resource or something, put those little chips, in the bank of here's some information you might find interesting. Here's a story you might find interesting. You as the comms person can build that relationship with the reporter so that the reporter understands they can trust you or use you as a resource. And yes, you have to be honest in what you're saying. If you're obfuscating, they will sniff that out. If you are lying, they will assume that they can't trust you from that point on, and rightly so. Don't try to be cute. Don't only go to them for the easy stuff. If they come to you with something hard and you have some messaging you need to get out, then do it. Don't avoid a reporter who is coming to you with a question that's difficult. Unless it's definitely something you don't want out there, as Ed mentioned. But answer the hard questions as well as the easy questions as best you can, so that the reporter understands that you're not just trying to use them.
And from my own personal experience as an investigative journalist, I knew that the moment that I would get an answer that I could really use was when I was walking someone out to their car, or when they thought the interview was over. And I know that for many of the Zoom calls that we have, the interview doesn't feel like it starts yet. We go, how's my sound? Can you hear me? Etc. And one thing that we always train our CEOs and spokespeople to do is understand the interview begins when you are in proximity, in whatever way you're in proximity, to that reporter. Afterwards, if you have coffee with them afterwards, if you get into an elevator with them and are leaving, there is no not for attribution off the record as far as we're concerned. Ed, Kim, any thoughts about when does the interview begin and when does it end?
I agree with what you just said. Anytime you're around a reporter, it's all fair game. I'm not a real fan of, hey, can I tell you something off the record? That puts the reporter in a bad position as well as yourself. You should never do that. I know that in the political world, there's all kinds of, background information like that that floats around, and that's part of that world. It's not my world. I don't have to work in that arena. But I would assume that anything I say is fair game for a reporter who hears it.
And when it comes to the debriefing as well, if you are going to debrief with your principal and you're both on Zoom, close out the session you had in the interview and open up an entirely new call, so that, it's pretty obvious in most cases to tell who might be lurking, but play it safe. You never know. Now, in terms of off the record, I've got a different perspective on that, and I've done a lot of research on this. So off the record, I think, is a useful device in limited situations, as are terms like on background and not for attribution. We can get into specifics and how they differ, but I will suggest that these are tried and true techniques that can work if you are a communications person who is schooled in using them.
Excellent. So we are coming toward the end, and wow, you guys were just terrific, and we're very grateful for everything that you've shared. So in classic style, as we do an interview with the two of you, what are the takeaways? What are, for this audience of corporate communications people, Marcom people, etc., what should they leave this Zoom workshop stuck in their head as the most important takeaways? Ed, could you start?
I'm going to come back, Paul, to sustained professional development. It's got to be over time that you are improving either your capabilities as a media spokesperson or your CEO and your other spokespeople's capabilities. It's not something you can do by just checking a box of the media training workshop and saying, oh, okay, that's done. We'll wait till next year, or whatever your preference is. So it's having a plan. It's having a program that is written out and timed out. So you've got a timeline that indicates perhaps we start with a media training workshop on a formal basis. Then we go to some more informal steps. 6 months later, we come back to another formal workshop, whatever meets your needs, and engage with your consultant, because any consultant on media training should be familiar with this. And if you ask them what media training is, listen to the answer. And if the answer is something like, well, we get everybody together and we put them in a room, we record them, we play it back, well, that may be okay. But if the answer is something along the lines of, it's a sustained program, it's something that you need to do over time, here are some of the elements that might come into play. Let's have a deeper conversation to see what those look like for you specifically.
Excellent. Kim, what are the takeaways that our audience should keep in mind as they think about media coaching, media training their executives?
Well, so not to parrot Ed, because I agree with what he's saying, remove the technical hurdles, make sure that the person has the technology right and that they're comfortable with it. And preparation is the key. So if you can inform them who the reporter is, a little bit about the reporter, go through the messaging that they need to have in front of them, the types of questions that might be answered, so that they go into the interview feeling comfortable and well prepared. Also, ramp it up slowly. Don't start your executives. They've never done any media work at all. Don't put them in front of the New York Times. Start with something small so that they can take baby steps and work their way into it and feel comfortable, and give them feedback, and as honest as possible. I know some people don't always accept that well, but think about how you want to do that. But that feedback is important. Every executive I know who is good in front of the media has asked me for that feedback.
Kim, thank you. This brings us to the end of what was one of the seemingly fastest Sharper Angle events we've had, because there was so much here to absorb. This event was brought to you by Maccabee Public Relations in Minneapolis. We have great thanks to everybody who listened in today, but special thanks to Kim Inslee and Ed Barks for your insights. It was absolutely fantastic to talk with you folks. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, everybody. Stay safe, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Kim.